Imagine opening an ancient family album that spans thousands of years. This is exactly what the first 9 chapters of Chronicles are. God's own family tree that shows how every person on earth connects to his grand plan. These aren't just boring lists of names. They're the foundation of everything that matters in human history. The story begins where all stories must begin, at the very beginning. In chapter 1, verse 1, the writer simply states, Adam, Seth, Enosh. Just 3 names, but they carry the weight of all human history. Adam was the first man God created, breathing life into dust and making him a living soul. Seth came after the tragedy of Cain and Abel, representing hope after humanity's first murder. Enosh means mortal, reminding us that even though we're made in God's image, we're still human and fragile. The list continues smoothly in verses 2 through 4. Kenan, Mahalalel, Jared, Enoch, Methuselah, Lamech, Noah. Each name represents a generation that passed down not just DNA, but the knowledge of God. Enoch walked with God so closely that God took him without dying. Methuselah lived 969 years, the oldest person who ever lived. Noah saved humanity from complete destruction through the flood. What makes this remarkable is how the writer treats these names. He doesn't give long stories about each person. Instead, he presents them like links in an unbreakable chain, each generation connected to the next, carrying forward God's plan even when they didn't fully understand it. This wasn't just Hebrew history. This was human history. Every person reading these words today can trace their family line back to these same names. The genealogy moves forward without break or pause, showing that God's plan never stopped moving through human history. From Adam to Noah, 10 generations of people lived, died, and passed on both life and faith. Each name represented decades of human experience, but together they formed the foundation for everything that would follow. After the flood, humanity got a fresh start through Noah's 3 sons. Chapter 1, verses 5 through 23, maps out how the whole world was repopulated. The writer records, the sons of Japheth were Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal, Meshech, and Tiras. These weren't just random names. They became the founders of entire nations. Japheth's descendants moved north and west, becoming the peoples of Europe and Asia Minor. Verse 6 expands on Gomer's line. The sons of Gomer, Ashkenaz, Riphath, and Togarmah. Verse 7 continues with Javan's descendants, the sons of Javan, Elisha, Tarshish, Kittim, and Rodanim. Each name represents thousands of people who would spread across the known world. The writer continues in verse 8. The sons of Ham were Cush, Egypt, Put, and Canaan. Ham's children spread across Africa and parts of the Middle East. Egypt became the mighty kingdom where Jacob's family would later live for 400 years. Canaan became the promised land that God would give to Abraham's descendants. Verses 9 and 10 detail Cush's line. The sons of Cush, Seba, Havilah, Sabta, Raamah, and Sabteka. The sons of Raamah, Sheba, and Dedan. Cush fathered Nimrod. He was the first on earth to be a mighty man. Nimrod stands out as someone who became famous for his strength and hunting ability, but the focus quickly moves to other descendants. Verses 11 and 12 trace Egypt's line. Egypt fathered Ludim, Anamim, Lehabim, Naphtuhim, Pathrusim, Kazluhim, from whom the Philistines came, and Caphtorim. The Philistines would later become Israel's greatest enemies, but here they're simply listed as part of God's human family. Verses 13 through 16 detail Canaan's descendants. Canaan fathered Sidon, his firstborn, and Heth, and the Jebusites, the Amorites, the Girgashites, the Hivites, the Archites, the Sinites, the Arvadites, the Zemarites, and the Hamathites. These were the people living in the promised land when Abraham arrived. They weren't evil by nature. They were simply other branches of Noah's family tree. But it's Shem's line that gets special attention. Verse 17 tells us, the sons of Shem were Elam, Ashur, Arphaxad, Lud, Aram, Uz, Hul, Gether, and Meshech. From Shem came the Semitic peoples, including the Hebrews. Verses 18 through 21 trace Arphaxad's line carefully. Arphaxad fathered Shelah, and Shelah fathered Eber. To Eber were born 2 sons. The name of the one was Peleg, for in his days the earth was divided, and his brother's name was Joktan. Joktan fathered Almodad, Sheleph, Hazarmaveth, Jerah. The writer is showing us that God had a plan from the very beginning. Out of all the nations that spread across the earth, he would choose one family line to carry his special promise. What's beautiful here is seeing God's heart for all nations. He didn't create some people to be forgotten. Every tribe, every language, every people group traces back to these same 3 brothers who walked off Noah's Ark together. Now the writer zooms in like a camera, focusing on its main subject. Chapter 1, verse 27 makes the smooth transition. Abram, that is Abraham. This is where universal history becomes salvation history. Abraham wasn't chosen because he was perfect or special in himself. He was chosen because God decided to make a promise that would bless every nation on earth. Verse 28 continues without fanfare. The sons of Abraham were Isaac and Ishmael. Here we see God's faithfulness playing out in human families. Isaac was the child of promise, born to Sarah when she was 90 years old. Ishmael was born to Hagar, representing human attempts to help God fulfill his promises. Both sons received blessings, but only Isaac carried the line of promise forward. The writer then carefully lists Ishmael's descendants in verses 29 through 31. These are their genealogies: the firstborn of Ishmael, Nebaioth, then Kedar, Adbeel, Mibsam, Mishma, Duma, Massa, Hadad, Tema, Jetur, Naphish, and Kedema. These were the sons of Ishmael. God kept his promise to make Ishmael a great nation too. The Arab peoples trace their heritage to these names. Each name represents a tribe that would grow into thousands of people. Verses 32 and 33 mention Abraham's other sons through Keturah. The sons of Keturah, Abraham's concubine, she bore Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua. The sons of Jokshan, Sheba, and Dedan. The sons of Midian, Ephah, Hanok, Abida, and Eldah. All these were the descendants of Keturah. Abraham became the father of many nations, just as God promised. But the focus shifts quickly to Isaac in verse 34. Abraham fathered Isaac. The sons of Isaac, Esau and Israel. Israel was Jacob's new name after wrestling with God. This wasn't just a name change. It was a destiny change. Jacob the deceiver became Israel the prince with God. From this point forward, the story isn't about all of Abraham's descendants, but specifically about Israel's children. The writer gives attention to Esau's line in verses 35 through 54, listing the chiefs and kings of Edom. But this serves to show the contrast. Esau's descendants became powerful in earthly terms, but Israel's descendants would carry God's spiritual promises. Both lines mattered, but they had different destinies. Chapter 2 begins the detailed breakdown of Israel's family. Verse 1 lists the foundation. These are the sons of Israel: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Dan, Joseph, Benjamin, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. 12 sons who became 12 tribes. This wasn't accidental. 12 represents completeness in God's plan. Each tribe had its own character and destiny. Reuben was the firstborn, but lost his birthright because of sin with his father's concubine. Simeon and Levi were scattered among the other tribes because of their violence against the people of Shechem. But God turned even their punishment into purpose. Levi became the priestly tribe, serving God in the temple. The writer doesn't just list names randomly. He organizes them to show God's order. Some tribes get more attention than others, not because some were more important, but because they played specific roles in God's plan. Joseph's tribe was divided between his two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, making 13 tribes total, but Levi didn't get land because they were set apart for religious service. What's remarkable is how God used a broken, dysfunctional family to create a nation. These 12 brothers had jealousy, rivalry, and deep hurt between them. Joseph's brothers sold him into slavery out of jealousy. Judah slept with his daughter-in-law thinking she was a prostitute. Reuben slept with his father's concubine. Yet God wove their stories together into something beautiful and purposeful. The writer begins tracing each tribal line with careful attention to detail. This wasn't just ancient record-keeping, it was preserving the foundation of God's chosen people. Every name mattered because every person had a role in God's bigger plan. The tribes would inherit specific territories, have specific responsibilities, and contribute to Israel's overall strength in different ways. The writer spends more time on Judah than any other tribe, and there's a good reason. Chapter 2, verse 3 begins, "The sons of Judah, Onan, and Shelah. These three Bathshua the Canaanite bore to him. Now Judah's firstborn, was evil in the sight of the Lord, and he put him to death." Right from the start, we see that God's choices aren't based on human expectations. The story gets complicated. With Tamar in verses 4 and 5, his daughter-in-law Tamar also bore him Perez and Zerah. All the sons of Judah were 5. Tamar disguised herself as a prostitute to get justice from Judah when he refused to give her his third son as husband. It sounds scandalous, but Perez became an ancestor of King David, and ultimately Jesus Christ. God uses even messy situations to accomplish his purposes. The writer traces Judah's line carefully through multiple generations. Verses 9 through 12 show the progression. The sons of Hezron that were born to him, Jerahmeel, Ram, and Chelubai. Ram fathered Amminadab, and Amminadab fathered Nahshon, prince of the sons of Judah. Nahshon fathered Salmon, Salmon fathered Boaz. These names matter because they lead directly to David's family tree. Boaz married Ruth, the Moabite woman who chose to follow her mother-in-law Naomi back to Israel. Their son Obed is mentioned in verse 12. Boaz fathered Obed, Obed fathered Jesse. Jesse became the father of David, Israel's greatest king. The writer is carefully building the case that David's kingship wasn't accidental. It was part of God's plan from the beginning. But Judah's prominence wasn't just about producing kings. The writer shows how Judah's other descendants also played important roles. Verses 18 through 24 detail Caleb's line, including his son Hur and grandson Bezalel, who would later become the master craftsman for building the tabernacle. Even the artistic gifts needed for worship traced back to Judah's family. The writer continues tracing various branches of Judah's family tree through the rest of chapter 2 and into chapter 4. He mentions cities they founded, battles they fought, and skills they developed. Judah wasn't just one family. It became a complex network of clans and communities, each contributing to the tribe's overall strength and influence. While Judah carried the royal line, Levi carried something equally important, the priestly line. Chapter 6 begins with a careful record in verses 1 through 3. The sons of Levi, Gershon, Kohath, and Merari. The sons of Kohath, Amram, Izhar, Hebron, and Uzziel. The children of Amram, Aaron, Moses, and Miriam. These 3 branches of Levi's family each had specific jobs in God's worship system. From Amram came the most famous family in Hebrew history. Aaron became the first high priest. Moses led Israel out of Egypt. And Miriam was a prophetess and worship leader. One family produced the deliverer, the high priest, and a music minister. This wasn't coincidence. God was preparing them for their roles generations before they were needed. The writer lists Aaron's descendants carefully in verses 4 through 15. Eleazar fathered Phinehas. Phinehas fathered Abishua. Abishua fathered Buki. Buki fathered Uzi. Uzi fathered Zerahiah. Zerahiah fathered Merioth. Merioth fathered Amariah. Amariah fathered Ahitub. Ahitub fathered Zadok. Zadok fathered Ahimaaz. Ahimaaz fathered Azariah. Azariah fathered Johanan. And Johanan fathered Azariah. It was he who served as priest in the house that Solomon built in Jerusalem. Azariah fathered Amariah. Amariah fathered Ahitub. Ahitub fathered Zadok. Zadok fathered Shallum. Shallum fathered Hilkiah. Hilkiah fathered Azariah. Azariah fathered Sariah, and Sariah fathered Jehozadak. And Jehozadak went into exile when the Lord sent Judah and Jerusalem into exile by the hand of Nebuchadnezzar. This long list shows how God preserved the priestly line through centuries of ups and downs. Even when the kingdom fell and the people went into exile, the priestly families kept their identity intact. They knew exactly who they were and what their calling was. Zadok became especially important during David's reign, remaining loyal when other priests rebelled. The writer also details the other Levitical families. Verses 16 through 30 trace the Gershonite line, and verses 31 through 47 follow the Merarite, your families. Each group had specific responsibilities in transporting and caring for the tabernacle. The Kohathites carried the holy objects, the Gershonites handled the curtains and coverings, and the Merarites managed the structural framework. Verses 48 through 53 explain how the Levites were set apart, and their brothers the Levites were appointed for all the service of the tabernacle of the house of God. But Aaron and his sons made offerings on the altar of burnt offering and on the altar of incense for all the work of the most holy place, and to make atonement for Israel, according to all that Moses, the servant of God, had commanded. These are the sons of Aaron: Eleazar his son, Phinehas his son, Abishua his son, Buki his son, Uzi his son, Zerahiah his son, Merioth his son, Amariah his son, Ahitub his son, Zadok his son, Ahimaaz his son. After 70 years in Babylon, something amazing happened. Chapter 9, verse 1 explains the situation. So all Israel was recorded in genealogies, and these are written in the book of the kings of Israel. And Judah was taken into exile in Babylon because of their breach of faith. The exile wasn't the end of the story. It was a new beginning that required careful attention to family records. Verse 2 describes the return. Now the first to dwell again in their possessions, in their cities, were Israel, the priests, the Levites, and the temple servants. Notice the order: regular Israelites first, then the religious leaders. God was rebuilding his people from the ground up, starting with families who remembered their heritage and were willing to leave comfortable lives in Babylon. The writer lists specific families who returned. Verse 3 shows the diversity. And in Jerusalem lived some of the people of Judah, Benjamin, Ephraim, and Manasseh. These weren't just statistics. They were families who chose to leave the comfort and security of Babylon to rebuild something that had been destroyed decades earlier. They came back with their genealogies intact, knowing exactly which tribe they belonged to and what their responsibilities were. Verses 4 through 6 detail some of the Judahite families. Uthai, the son of Ammihud, son of Omri, son of Imri, son of Bani, from the sons of Perez, the son of Judah, and of the Shilonites, Asaiah the firstborn, and his sons. Of the sons of Zerah, Jul, and their kinsmen, 690. Each family group is carefully counted and recorded. The number 690 represents individual people who made the difficult journey back to Jerusalem. verses 7 through 9, list the Benjaminites. And of the Benjaminites, Salu the son of Meshullam, son of Hodaviah, son of Hasanua, Ibniah the son of Jeroham, Ela the son of Uzi, son of Mikri, and Meshullam the son of Shephatiah, son of Ruel, son of Ibnijah, and their kinsmen according to their generations, 956. All these men were heads of fathers' houses in their fathers' houses. The writer is showing that the return wasn't random or disorganized. People came back according to their tribal affiliations and family structures. They didn't lose their identity during the exile. They preserved it carefully and used it as the foundation for rebuilding their nation. The final piece of the puzzle was reorganizing Jerusalem itself to function as both a political capital and religious center. The writer shows how different groups were assigned specific roles and responsibilities. Verses 10 through 13 detail the priestly families who returned. Of the priests, Jedaiah, Jehoiarib, Jachin, and Azariah, the son of Hilkiah, son of Meshullam, son of Zadok, son of Meraioth, son of Ahitub, the chief officer of the house of God, and Adaiah, the son of Jeroham, son of Pashur, son of Malchijah, and Maasai, the son of Adiel, son of Jazerah, son of Meshullam, son of Meshilemith, son of Immer. Besides their kinsmen, heads of their fathers' houses, 1,260, mighty men for the work of the service of the house of God. These priests weren't just religious leaders, they were administrators, teachers, and judges. The phrase, mighty men for the work, shows they were capable and energetic people who could handle the enormous task of rebuilding temple worship from scratch. Many of them could trace their genealogies back to Aaron and knew exactly what their ancestors had done in the original temple. Verses 14 through 16 list the Levites who returned. And of the Levites, Shemaiah the son of Hashub, son of Azrikam, son of Hashabiah, of the sons of Merari, and Bakbakar, Heresh, Galal, and Mattaniah the son of Micah, son of Zikri, son of Asaph, and Obadiah the son of Shemaiah, son of Galal, son of Jeduthun, and Berechiah the son of Asa, son of Elkanah, who lived in the villages of the Netophathites. Notice that Asaph and Jeduthun are mentioned. These were the famous musicians from David's time. Their descendants were coming back to restore the musical worship that had made Jerusalem famous throughout the ancient world. They weren't just carrying on family traditions, they were reviving the worship patterns that David had established centuries earlier. Verses 17 through 27 describe the gatekeepers and their responsibilities. The gatekeepers were Shallum, Akub, Talmon, Ahiman, and their kinsmen. Shallum was the chief. Until then, they were in the king's gate on the east side as the gatekeepers of the camps of the Levites. Shallum, the son of Kor, son of Ebiasaph, son of Korah, and his kinsmen of his father's house, the Korahites, were in charge of the work of the service, keepers of the thresholds of the tent, as their fathers had been in charge of the camp of the Lord, keepers of the entrance. And Phinehas the son of Eleazar was the chief officer over them in time past. The Lord was with him. Zechariah the son of Meshelemiah was gatekeeper at the entrance of the tent of meeting. All these, who were chosen as gatekeepers at the thresholds, were 212. They were enrolled by genealogies in their villages. David and Samuel the seer established them in their office of trust. So they and their sons were in charge of the gates of the house of the Lord, that is, the house of the tent, as guards. The gatekeepers were on the four sides, east, west, north, and south, and their kinsmen who were in their villages were obligated to come in every 7 days, in turn, to be with these, for the 4 chief gatekeepers, who were Levites, were entrusted with the chambers and the treasures of the house of God, and they lodged around the house of God, for on them lay the duty of watching, and they had charge of opening it every morning. Even the gatekeepers kept their family records intact. They knew their ancestors had served in the same capacity during David's time, and even back to the wilderness wanderings. This wasn't just about having a job. It was about continuing a sacred family tradition that connected them to Israel's greatest spiritual moments. The writer concludes this section by showing how every role in the restored community was filled by people who knew their heritage and understood their purpose. The nation had been broken and scattered, but through careful preservation of family records and faithful obedience to God's call, it was being rebuilt exactly as God intended. Every person knew their place, their purpose, and their heritage. The roots of the chosen nation ran deep, and now they were ready to grow again. The story of David's rise to power begins with the tragic end of Israel's first king. Chapter 10, verse 1 sets the scene. Now the Philistines fought against Israel, and the men of Israel fled before the Philistines and fell slain on Mount Gilboa. This wasn't just another battle. It was the final confrontation that would change Israel's destiny forever. Verse 2 continues the grim account, and the Philistines overtook Saul and his sons. And the Philistines struck down Jonathan and Abinadab and Malchishua, the sons of Saul. Jonathan had been David's closest friend, the one who protected him when Saul tried to kill him. Now Jonathan lay dead on the battlefield, along with his brothers. The royal family was being wiped out in a single day. The writer shows us Saul's final moments in verses 3 and 4. The battle pressed hard against Saul, and the archers found him, and he was wounded by the archers. Then Saul said to his armor-bearer, "Draw your sword and thrust me through with it, lest these uncircumcised come and mistreat me." But his armor-bearer would not, for he feared greatly. Therefore Saul took his own sword and fell upon it. This was a man who had started with such promise. Saul was tall, handsome, and chosen by God to be Israel's first king. But pride, jealousy, and disobedience had slowly destroyed him from the inside. His fear of David had consumed him. His refusal to fully obey God's commands had cost him everything. Now he was taking his own life rather than face capture by Israel's enemies. Verse 5 shows how the tragedy spread. And when his armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he also fell upon his sword and died. Even Saul's faithful servant chose death over the shame of surviving his master's defeat. Verse 6 summarizes the devastation. Thus Saul died, and his 3 sons, and all his house died together. But the writer doesn't leave this as just a sad story about a failed king. Verses 13 and 14 explain why this had to happen. So Saul died for his breach of faith. He broke faith with the Lord in that he did not keep the command of the Lord, and also consulted a medium seeking guidance. He did not seek guidance from the Lord. Therefore the Lord put him to death and turned the kingdom over to David, the son of Jesse. Saul's downfall wasn't about his weaknesses as a person. It was about his failure to trust and obey God. He had tried to replace God's guidance with human wisdom and even occult practices. The kingdom couldn't prosper under leadership that rejected God's authority. David represented a new beginning, a king who would seek God's heart rather than following his own plans. With Saul dead, Israel needed a new king. But the transition wasn't automatic or simple. Chapter 11, verse 1 describes what happened next. Then all Israel gathered together to David at Hebron and said, "Behold, we are your bone and flesh." This was a moment years in the making. David had been anointed by Samuel as a teenager, but now he was finally receiving public recognition from the entire nation. The people's reasoning is recorded in verses 2 and 3. In times past, even when Saul was king, it was you who led out and brought in Israel. And the Lord your God said to you, "You shall be shepherd of my people Israel, and you shall be prince over my people Israel." So all the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron, and David made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord. And they anointed David king over Israel, according to the word of the Lord, by Samuel. This wasn't just political maneuvering, it was the fulfillment of God's promise. The elders remembered how David had led their armies to victory. While Saul was still alive, they recognized that God had chosen David as Israel's shepherd king. The covenant they made wasn't just between David and the people, it was made before the Lord, acknowledging that God was the ultimate authority over Israel's government. The writer emphasizes that this happened according to the word of the Lord by Samuel. David's kingship wasn't based on military conquest or political ambition. It was the direct result of God's choice, spoken through his prophet years earlier. The long wait was over, but it had served its purpose. Both David and the nation were ready for this moment. David was 30 years old when he became king, and he would rule for 40 years. But his reign didn't begin with inherited power or easy circumstances. He had to prove himself worthy of the trust the people were placing in him. The anointing at Hebron was just the beginning of his real work as Israel's leader. David's first major decision as king showed his brilliant strategic thinking. Instead of ruling from Saul's old capital, he chose to conquer a completely new city that would belong to no single tribe. Chapter 11 verse 4 tells us, "And David and all Israel went to Jerusalem, that is, Jebus, where the Jebusites were, the inhabitants of the land." The Jebusites had controlled this mountain fortress for centuries. They were so confident in their defenses that verse 5 records their taunt. "The inhabitants of Jebus said to David, 'You will not come in here.'" They believed their city was impossible to capture. The steep valleys on three sides and the strong walls made it seem impregnable. But David saw what others missed. Verse 5 continues, "Nevertheless, David took the stronghold of Zion, that is, the city of David." The writer doesn't give us all the details of how the conquest happened, but other biblical accounts tell us that David's men found a way through the water system that supplied the city. What seemed impossible became possible through clever tactics and brave soldiers. Verse 6 reveals David's motivational strategy. David said, "Whoever strikes the Jebusites first shall be chief and commander." And Joab, the son of Zeruiah, went up first, so he became chief. David knew how to inspire his men to extraordinary courage. By offering the top military position to whoever led the attack, he turned a dangerous mission into an opportunity for advancement. Joab won the prize and became David's military commander for the rest of his reign. This decision would have huge consequences for David's kingdom, both positive and negative. Joab was brilliant and loyal, but also ruthless and sometimes disobedient. Still, his courage in taking Jerusalem earned him the position. Verse 7 shows the results, "And David lived in the stronghold, therefore it was called the City of David." This wasn't just a change of address, it was a statement about David's kingship. Jerusalem belonged to no single tribe, so it could serve as a neutral capital that united all Israel. Its central location made it accessible to the entire nation. Its strategic position made it defensible against enemies. Verse 8 describes David's development plans. "And he built the city all around, from the Millo inward, and Joab repaired the rest of the city." David wasn't content just to capture Jerusalem. He wanted to make it worthy of being Israel's capital. The Millo was probably a supporting wall or terraced area that strengthened the city's defenses. Under David's leadership, Jerusalem grew from a small fortress into a magnificent royal city. Behind every great leader are the people who make success possible. David's greatest asset wasn't his own abilities, it was the incredibly loyal and skilled warriors who served him. Chapter 11 verse 10 introduces them. "Now these are the chiefs of David's mighty men, who gave him strong support in his kingdom, together with all Israel, to make him king, according to the word of the Lord concerning Israel." These weren't just soldiers. They were David's inner circle, men who had followed him through years of danger and hardship. Verse 11 begins with the most famous, "And this is an account of David's mighty men, Jashobim, a Hatchmanite, was chief of the three. He wielded his spear against 300 whom he killed at one time. Think about that for a moment. One man in a single battle killed 300 enemy soldiers. This wasn't ancient exaggeration. It was a historical record of extraordinary courage and skill. Jashabim earned his place as leader of the three through this incredible feat of arms. Verse 12 introduces the second member. And next to him among the three mighty men was Eleazar, the son of Dodo, the Ahohite. Verses 13 and 14 tell his story. He was with David at Pasdamim when the Philistines were gathered there for battle. There was a plot of ground full of barley, and the men fled from the Philistines. But he took his stand in the midst of the plot and defended it, and struck down the Philistines. And the Lord saved them by a great victory. Eleazar's story shows us something important about these mighty men. They didn't fight for personal glory or material gain when everyone else fled. From overwhelming odds, Eleazar stood his ground in a barley field and fought until God gave victory. He was willing to die for something as simple as protecting a farmer's crop because it represented the land God had given to Israel. The third member of this elite group was Shammah, though his individual story isn't detailed in Chronicles. But verses 15 through 19 tell us about all three men together. 3 of the 30 chief men went down to the rock to David at the cave of Adullam when the army of the Philistines was encamped in the valley of Rephaim. David was then in the stronghold, and the garrison of the Philistines was then at Bethlehem. And David said longingly, "Oh, that someone would give me water to drink from the well of Bethlehem that is by the gate." Then the 3 mighty men broke through the camp of the Philistines and drew water from the well of Bethlehem that was by the gate and brought it to David. But David would not drink it. He poured it out to the Lord and said, "Far be it from me before my God that I should do this. Shall I drink the blood of these men? For at the risk of their lives they brought it." Therefore, he would not drink it. This story reveals the character of both David and his men. David's casual comment about wanting water from his hometown well wasn't meant as a command, but his 3 closest warriors heard it as an opportunity to serve their beloved leader. They risked their lives fighting through enemy lines just to bring him a drink of water from a specific well. David's response shows why these men were so devoted to him. Instead of accepting their sacrifice casually, he treated their offering as sacred. He poured the water out as an offering to God, saying it was too precious to drink because it represented their blood, their willingness to die for him. This kind of mutual respect and honor created unbreakable bonds between David and his followers. Verses 20 through 25 introduce other members of this elite group. Now Abishai, the brother of Joab, was chief of the 30, and he wielded his spear against 300 men and killed them and won a name beside the 3. He was the most renowned of the 30 and became their commander, but he did not attain to the 3. And Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, was a valiant man. Of Kabzeel, a doer of great deeds. He struck down 2 Ariels of Moab. He also went down and struck down a lion in a pit on a day when snow had fallen, and he struck down an Egyptian, a man of great stature, 5 cubits tall. The Egyptian had in his hand a spear like a weaver's beam, but Benaiah went down to him with a staff and snatched the spear out of the Egyptian's hand and killed him with his own spear. These things did Benaiah the son of Jehoiada, and won a name beside the 3 mighty men. He was renowned among the 30, but he did not attain to the 3. And David set him over his bodyguard. Benaiah's exploits sound like something from an action movie. He killed a lion in a snowy pit. Imagine the courage required to follow a dangerous animal into a confined space during bad weather. He defeated a giant Egyptian warrior who was over 7 feet tall and armed with a massive spear, using nothing but a staff. These weren't lucky victories. They showed incredible skill, courage, and strength. The writer continues listing the 30 mighty men through verse 47, giving us names like Asahel, Elhanan, Shammath, Helez, and many others. Each name represents a warrior who had proven his loyalty and courage in service to David. Some we know stories about, others are just names to us now. But each one mattered in building David's kingdom. These men came from different tribes and backgrounds, but they were united in their devotion to David and their commitment to establishing God's kingdom in Israel. They represent the kind of followers every leader dreams of having: skilled, loyal, brave, and willing to sacrifice for something greater than themselves. David's support didn't come only from the famous 30 mighty men. Chapter 12 shows us how his following grew from a small band of outcasts to a national army. The chapter begins with those who joined him while he was still hiding from Saul at Ziklag. Verses 1 and 2 introduce these early supporters. Now these are the men who came to David at Ziklag, while he could not move about freely because of Saul the son of Kish, and they were among the mighty men who helped him in war. They were bowmen, and could shoot arrows and sling stones with either the right hand or the left. They were Benjaminites, Saul's kinsmen. This is remarkable. Benjamin was Saul's own tribe, yet some of its best warriors were defecting to David. These weren't just ordinary soldiers. They were elite fighters who could use both hands equally well with their weapons. Their decision to join David showed that even people from Saul's own family recognized that God was with David instead of with their king. Verses 8 through 15 describe another group that joined David. From the Gadites, there went over to David, at the stronghold in the wilderness, mighty and experienced warriors, expert with shield and spear, whose faces were like the faces of lions, and who were swift as gazelles upon the mountains. The description continues with specific names and their abilities. These were professional soldiers who could have served any king, but they chose to follow David during his most difficult period. The writer emphasizes their courage in verse 15. These are the men who crossed the Jordan in the first month, when it was overflowing all its banks, and put to flight all those in the valleys, to the east and to the west. Crossing the Jordan at flood stage was extremely dangerous. These men risked their lives just to join David's cause. Their success in battle after crossing showed that God was blessing their decision. Verses 16 through 18 tell us about men from Benjamin and Judah who came to David. And some of the men of Benjamin and Judah came to the stronghold to David. David went out to meet them and said to them, "If you have come to me in friendship to help me, my heart will be joined to you. But if to betray me to my adversaries, although there is no wrong in my hands, then may the God of our fathers see and rebuke you." Then the Spirit clothed Amasai, chief of the 30, and he said, "We are yours, O David, and with you, O son of Jesse, peace to you and peace to your helpers, for your God helps you." This scene shows David's wisdom as a leader. He didn't automatically trust everyone who claimed to want to join him. Saul had sent spies and assassins before. But when Amasai spoke under the inspiration of God's Spirit, David knew these men were genuine. Their declaration, "We are yours, O David," became a rallying cry for all who served him. The chapter continues describing various groups that joined David from different tribes. Verses 23 through 40 give us the numbers of armed men who came to make David king. These are the numbers of the divisions of the armed troops who came to David in Hebron to turn the kingdom of Saul over to him, according to the word of the Lord. The total was massive. Over 300,000 trained soldiers from all 12 tribes. What's amazing is that verse 38 tells us, all these men of war, arrayed in battle order, came to Hebron with a whole heart to make David king over all Israel. Likewise, all the rest of Israel were of one mind to make David king. This wasn't a military coup or a contested succession. The entire nation was united in recognizing David as their rightful king. One of David's first priorities as king was bringing the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. This sacred chest represented God's presence among his people, and it had been neglected during Saul's reign. Chapter 13, verse 1 shows David's approach. David consulted with the commanders of thousands and of hundreds, with every leader. This wasn't a decision David made alone. He involved Israel's leadership in planning how to restore proper worship. Verses 2 and 3 record David's proposal. And David said to all the assembly of Israel, "If it seems good to you and from the Lord our God, let us send abroad to our brothers who remain in all the lands of Israel, as well as to the priests and Levites in the cities that have pasture lands, that they may be gathered to us. Then let us bring again the ark of our God to us, for we did not seek it in the days of Saul." David's heart was right. He wanted to restore God's proper place at the center of Israel's national life. The people agreed enthusiastically. Verse 4 tells us, all the assembly agreed to do so, for the thing was right in the eyes of all the people. The ark was currently at Kiriath Jearim, where it had remained since the Philistines returned it years earlier after capturing it in battle. Verse 5 describes the beginning of the procession. So David assembled all Israel from the Shihor of Egypt to Lebo-Hamath to bring the ark of God from Kiriath Jearim. This was meant to be a great celebration. Verse 6 shows the enormous crowd. And David and all Israel went up to Bala, that is, to Kiriath Jearim, that belongs to Judah, to bring up from there the ark of God, which is called by the name of the Lord who sits enthroned above the cherubim. But David made a crucial mistake. Verse 7 tells us, and they carried the ark of God on a new cart from the house of Abinadab, and Uzzah and Ahio were driving the cart. This seems like a reasonable solution. After all, the Philistines had successfully transported the ark on a cart when they returned it to Israel. But God had given specific instructions that only the Levites could carry the ark, and only by using poles inserted through rings on its sides. The celebration continued with great joy. Verse 8 describes the scene. And David and all Israel were celebrating before God with all their might, with song and lyres and harps and tambourines and cymbals and trumpets. Everyone was excited about bringing God's presence back to the center of their national life. Then disaster struck. Verses 9 and 10 record the tragedy. And when they came to the threshing floor of Chidon, Uzzah put out his hand to take hold of the ark, for the oxen stumbled. And the anger of the Lord was kindled against Uzzah, and he struck him down, because he put out his hand to the ark, and he died there before God. Uzzah's death shocked everyone. His intentions were good. He was trying to prevent the ark from falling when the oxen stumbled. But good intentions don't replace obedience to God's commands. The ark was so holy that even touching it meant death, regardless of the motive. Verse 11 shows David's reaction. And David was angry because the Lord had broken out against Uzzah, and that place is called Perez Uzzah to this day. David's anger reveals his spiritual immaturity at this point in his life. Instead of recognizing his own mistake in not following God's instructions, he was upset with God for enforcing his holy standards. Verse 12 tells us the result. And David was afraid of God that day, and he said, "How can I bring the ark of God home to me?" The celebration had turned into a funeral. David's plans were ruined, and he was confused about what had gone wrong. Verse 13 shows David's decision. So David did not take the ark home into the city of David, but took it aside to the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite. Rather than continue to Jerusalem, David left the ark with a Levite family in a nearby town. The great procession ended in failure and disappointment. David didn't give up on bringing the ark to Jerusalem, but he took time to figure out what had gone wrong. The ark remained with Obed-Edom for 3 months, and verse 14 tells us the results. And the ark of God remained with the household of Obed-Edom in his house 3 months, and the Lord blessed the household of Obed-Edom and all that he had. This blessing showed David that God wasn't opposed to the ark being moved. He was opposed to it being moved incorrectly. The problem wasn't the plan, but the method. During those 3 months, David studied the law and learned how God wanted the ark to be transported. Chapter 15, verse 1 shows David's renewed preparation. David built houses for himself in the city of David, and he prepared a place for the ark of God and pitched a tent for it. This time David was being much more careful. He wasn't just moving the ark, he was preparing a proper place for it to rest. Verse 2 reveals what David had learned. Then David said that no one but the Levites may carry the ark of God, for the Lord has chosen them to carry the ark of the Lord and to minister to him forever. This was the key insight David had missed the first time. God had given specific instructions about who could handle the ark and how it should be transported. Verses 3 and 4 show David's new approach. And David assembled all Israel at Jerusalem to bring up the ark of the Lord to its place, which he had prepared for it. And David gathered together the sons of Aaron and the Levites. This time David called specifically for the priests and Levites, the people God had designated for this task. The writer lists the Levitical families David summoned in verses 5 through 10. Of the sons of Kohath, Uriel the chief, with 120 of his brothers. Of the sons of Merari, Asaiah the chief, with 220 of his brothers. Of the sons of Gershon, Joel the chief, with 130 of his brothers. Of the sons of Elizaphan, Shemaiah the chief, with 200 of his brothers. Of the sons of Hebron, Eliel the chief, with 80 of his brothers. Of the sons of Uzziel, Aminadab the chief, with 112 of his brothers. These weren't just any Levites, they were the family heads and their trained assistants. David was making sure he had enough qualified people to handle the ark properly. The total was 862 Levites specifically prepared for this sacred task. Verses 11 through 13 record David's instructions to the Levitical leaders. Then David summoned the priests Zadok and Abiathar, and the Levites Uriel, Asaiah, Joel, Shemaiah, Eliel, and Aminadab, and said to them, "You are the heads of the fathers' houses of the Levites. Consecrate yourselves, you and your brothers, so that you may bring up the ark of the Lord, the God of Israel, to the place that I have prepared for it. Because you did not carry it the first time, the Lord our God broke out against us, for we did not seek him according to the rule." David had learned his lesson. He took full responsibility for the previous failure and made sure it wouldn't happen again. The phrase, "we did not seek him according to the rule," shows that David now understood the importance of following God's specific instructions rather than doing what seemed reasonable to human thinking. Verse 14 tells us the result. So the priests and the Levites consecrated themselves to bring up the ark of the Lord, the God of Israel. This time, everyone involved prepared themselves spiritually as well as practically for handling the sacred ark. The second attempt to bring the ark to Jerusalem was completely different from the first. Chapter 15, verse 15 describes the proper method. And the Levites carried the ark of God on their shoulders with the poles, as Moses had commanded according to the word of the Lord. No cart this time, just careful obedience to God's original instructions. The celebration was even more magnificent than before. Verses 16 through 24 detail the musical arrangements David organized. David also commanded the chiefs of the Levites to appoint their brothers as the singers who should play loudly on musical instruments, on harps and lyres and cymbals to raise sounds of joy. The writer lists specific musicians and their instruments, showing how carefully David planned every aspect of the worship. Asaph, Heman, and Ethan were appointed as the chief musicians, playing bronze cymbals. Other Levites played harps and lyres. Still others served as gatekeepers for the ark. David was establishing patterns of worship that would continue for generations. Verse 25 describes the procession. So David and the elders of Israel and the commanders of thousands went to bring up the ark of the covenant of the Lord from the house of Obed-Edom with rejoicing. This time there was no fear or uncertainty, only joy and celebration. Verse 26 tells us something remarkable. And because God helped the Levites who were carrying the ark of the covenant of the Lord, they sacrificed 7 bulls and 7 rams. God's blessing was evident from the beginning. The Levites could feel divine assistance as they carried their sacred burden. The celebration reached its peak as the ark entered Jerusalem. Verse 27 describes David's participation. David was clothed with a robe of fine linen, as also were all the Levites who were carrying the ark, and the singers and Chenaniah, the leader of the music of the singers. And David wore a linen ephod. David dressed as a priest, showing his heart for worship and his recognition that this was primarily a spiritual event. Verse 28 captures the atmosphere. So all Israel brought up the ark of the covenant of the Lord with shouting, to the sound of the horn, trumpets, and cymbals, and made loud music on harps and lyres. The entire nation was celebrating together. Rich and poor, young and old, all tribes united in worshiping God. Verse 29 provides a personal note. And as the ark of the covenant of the Lord came to the city of David, Michal, the daughter of Saul, looked out of the window and saw King David dancing and celebrating, and she despised him in her heart. Not everyone understood David's heart for worship. His own wife was embarrassed by his enthusiastic praise. But David didn't let criticism stop him from expressing his joy in God. The ark was finally home in Jerusalem, and the city was becoming not just Israel's political capital, but its spiritual center as well. God's presence was dwelling among his people again, and David had learned valuable lessons about the importance of approaching God according to his revealed will rather than human wisdom. The successful transport of the ark marked a turning point in David's reign. He had proven himself as a military leader by conquering Jerusalem and gathering mighty warriors. Now he was proving himself as a spiritual leader by restoring proper worship and making God's presence central to Israel's national life. The foundation was being laid for the golden age of Israel's history after David had successfully brought the ark to Jerusalem and established his kingdom. His heart was stirred with the desire to build something permanent for God. Chapter 17, verse 1 sets the scene. Now when David lived in his house, David said to Nathan the prophet, "Behold, I dwell in a house of cedar, but the ark of the covenant of the Lord is under a tent." David felt uncomfortable living in luxury while God's ark remained in a temporary structure. This wasn't pride or showing off. It was genuine love for God. David had built himself a beautiful palace with imported cedar wood from Lebanon. Meanwhile, the ark that represented God's presence among his people was housed in the tent he had pitched for it. The contrast bothered David's conscience. Nathan the prophet initially encouraged David's idea. Verse 2 records his response. And Nathan said to David, "Do all that is in your heart, for God is with you." Nathan could see David's sincere motivation and assumed that such a good desire would naturally have God's blessing. It seemed logical that God would want a permanent temple instead of a portable tent. But that very night, God spoke to Nathan with a different message. Verse 3 tells us, "But that same night, the word of God came to Nathan." What followed was one of the most important prophecies in the entire Bible. The promise that would shape not only David's dynasty, but ultimately point to the coming Messiah. God's message began with a gentle correction in verses 4 through 6. "Go and tell my servant, David, thus says the Lord, you shall not build me a house to dwell in. For I have not lived in a house since the day I brought up Israel from Egypt to this day, but I have gone from tent to tent and from dwelling to dwelling. In all places where I have moved with all Israel, did I speak a word with any of the judges of Israel, whom I commanded to shepherd my people, saying, why have you not built me a house of cedar?" God wasn't rejecting David's desire to honor him. He was showing that his presence wasn't limited to buildings. For centuries, God had traveled with his people in the tabernacle, moving whenever they moved. He had never complained about not having a permanent temple. The tent wasn't a problem to be solved. It was a symbol of God's willingness to dwell among his people wherever they went. Then came the beautiful reversal in verses 7 through 10. "Now, therefore, thus shall you say to my servant David, thus says the Lord of hosts, I took you from the pasture, from following the sheep, that you should be prince over my people Israel. And I have been with you wherever you have gone, and have cut off all your enemies from before you. And I will make for you a name, like the name of the great ones of the earth. And I will appoint a place for my people Israel, and will plant them, that they may dwell in their own place, and be disturbed no more. And violent men shall waste them no more as formerly, from the time that I appointed judges over my people Israel, and I will subdue all your enemies." God reminded David of his humble beginnings and all the victories he had given him. David wanted to build God a house, but God was promising to build David a house, not a physical building, but a royal dynasty that would last forever. The heart of the promise comes in verses 11 through 14. "Moreover, I declare to you that the Lord will build you a house. When your days are fulfilled to go to be with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you, one of your own sons, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for me, and I will establish his throne forever. I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. I will not take my steadfast love from him, as I took it from him who was before you, but I will confirm him in my house and in my kingdom forever, and his throne shall be established forever." This promise had multiple layers of fulfillment. Immediately, it pointed to Solomon, who would indeed build the temple and rule over a peaceful, prosperous kingdom. But the language of forever pointed beyond any human king to the ultimate Son of David, who would establish an eternal kingdom. Jesus Christ, David's response shows his humility and gratitude. Verses 16 and 17 record his prayer. "Then King David went in and sat before the Lord and said, Who am I, O Lord God, and what is my house, that you have brought me thus far? And this was a small thing in your eyes, O God. You have also spoken of your servant's house for a great while to come, and have shown me future generations, O Lord God." David was overwhelmed by God's goodness. He started as a shepherd boy and became king of Israel. But now God was promising that his family would rule forever. The magnitude of this promise was almost too much to comprehend. The rest of David's prayer in verses 18 through 27 shows his heart of worship and his recognition that this promise was bigger than just his own family. It was part of God's plan to bless all nations through Israel. David understood that he was part of something eternal and cosmic in scope. With God's promise of an eternal dynasty secure, David turned his attention to the practical work of establishing and securing his kingdom. Chapter 18 begins a series of military campaigns that would expand Israel's territory to its greatest extent in history. Verse 1 starts with the most persistent enemy. After this, David defeated the Philistines and subdued them, and he took Gath and its villages out of the hand of the Philistines. The Philistines had been Israel's primary enemy for generations. They had killed Saul and his sons, captured the ark years earlier, and constantly threatened Israel's security. Now David was turning the tables, not just defeating them in battle, but actually capturing their cities. Gath was one of their 5 major cities and the hometown of Goliath, the giant David had killed as a young man. Verse 2 describes David's campaign against Moab. And he defeated Moab, and the Moabites became servants to David and brought tribute. This was significant because Ruth, David's great-grandmother, had been a Moabite. But national relationships couldn't be based on family sentiment. David had to secure Israel's borders against all potential threats. The campaign against Syria proved even more decisive. Verses 3 and 4 record, David also defeated Hadadezer, king of Zobah, toward Hamath, as he went to set up his monument at the river Euphrates, and David took from him 1,000 chariots, 7,000 horsemen, and 20,000 foot soldiers. And David hamstrung all the chariot horses, but left enough for 100 chariots. This was a massive victory against a powerful enemy. Hadadezer controlled territory stretching toward the Euphrates River, far to the north of Israel's traditional borders. The capture of so many chariots and horses represented enormous wealth and military power. David's decision to hamstring most of the chariot horses showed his continued dependence on God rather than military technology. When other Syrian kingdoms tried to help Hadadezer, David defeated them too. Verses 5 and 6 tell us, And when the Syrians of Damascus came to help Hadadezer, king of Zobah, David struck down 22,000 men of the Syrians. Then David put garrisons in Syria of Damascus, and the Syrians became servants to David and brought tribute. And the Lord gave victory to David wherever he went. The key phrase is, the Lord gave victory to David wherever he went. These weren't just military conquests, they were fulfillments of God's promise to subdue all of David's enemies. Each victory expanded Israel's territory and influence while bringing in tribute that would help fund the future temple. Verses 7 and 8 describe the wealth David captured. And David took the shields of gold that were carried by the servants of Hadadezer and brought them to Jerusalem. And from Tibhath and from Kun, cities of Hadadezer, David took very much bronze, with which Solomon made the bronze sea and the pillars and the vessels of bronze. Even in the midst of military campaigns, David was thinking about the temple. The gold shields became part of Jerusalem's treasury, and the bronze would later be used by Solomon for temple furniture. Every victory was contributing to the future house of God. The victories had diplomatic consequences too. Verse 9 and 10 record, When Tou, king of Hamath, heard that David had defeated the whole army of Hadadezer, king of Zobah, he sent his son, Hadoram, to King David, to ask about his welfare and to bless him because he had fought against Hadadezer and defeated him. For Hadadezer had been at war with Tou, and he sent all sorts of articles of gold, of silver, and of bronze. King Tou recognized that David was now the dominant power in the region. By sending tribute and congratulations, he was essentially acknowledging David's supremacy and seeking peace rather than war. This pattern repeated throughout the region as other kings realized they couldn't successfully oppose Israel's expanding power. Verse 11 shows David's heart. These also King David dedicated to the Lord, together with the silver and gold that he had carried off from all the nations, from Edom, Moab, the Ammonites, the Philistines, and Amalek. Every victory, every treasure captured was dedicated to God's service. David saw himself as God's steward, not the owner of his conquests. Military victory was only the first step in building a successful kingdom. David also had to create an effective government that could manage Israel's expanded territory and growing wealth. Chapter 18, verses 14 through 17, give us a snapshot of David's administration. So David reigned over all Israel, and he administered justice and equity to all his people. This simple statement contains a profound truth about David's kingship. He didn't just rule over Israel, he served Israel. The phrase administered justice and equity shows that David took seriously his responsibility to ensure fair treatment for all his subjects, rich and poor alike. Verse 15 lists his key officials. Joab, the son of Zeruiah, was over the army, and Jehoshaphat, the son of Ahilud, was recorder. Joab had proven himself by leading the assault on Jerusalem and continued to serve as David's military commander. Jehoshaphat the recorder was essentially the royal secretary of state, responsible for keeping official records and handling correspondence. Verse 16 continues, and Zadok, the son of Ahitub, and Abiathar, the son of Ahimelech, were priests, and Shavshah was secretary. Having two high priests might seem unusual, but it reflected the transition period in Israel's history. Abiathar had supported David during his exile years, while Zadok represented the established priestly line. Both served faithfully during David's reign. Verse 17 concludes, and Benaiah the son of Jehoiada was over the Cherethites and the Pelethites, and David's sons were the chief officials in the service of the king. Benaiah, one of David's mighty men, commanded the royal bodyguard. The Cherethites and Pelethites were likely foreign mercenaries who served as David's personal protection force. The mention of David's sons as chief officials shows how the royal family was involved in government administration. Unlike many ancient kingdoms where royal children lived in luxury without responsibility, David expected his sons to contribute to the kingdom's work. This governmental structure served David well throughout his reign. By surrounding himself with capable, loyal administrators, he could focus on major policy decisions while trusting others to handle day-to-day operations. The system was efficient enough to manage a kingdom that now stretched from the Mediterranean sea to the Euphrates River. Not all of David's military campaigns were wars of conquest. Chapter 19 describes a conflict that began with David's attempt at diplomacy, but escalated into a major war. Verse 1 sets the stage. Now after this Nahash, the king of the Ammonites, died, and his son reigned in his place. Nahash had been friendly to David, possibly because they shared a common enemy in Saul. When he died, David decided to maintain good relations with the new king. Verse 2 records David's decision. And David said, I will deal kindly with Hanun, the son of Nahash, for his father dealt kindly with me. So David sent messengers to console him concerning his father. This shows David's character as a statesman. He didn't automatically assume that every neighboring kingdom was an enemy. When possible, he preferred diplomatic solutions to military ones. Sending a condolence delegation was normal diplomatic protocol and showed respect for the deceased king and his heir, but Hanun's advisors were suspicious of David's motives. Verse 3 records their counsel. But the princes of the Ammonites said to Hanun, Do you think, because David has sent comforters to you, that he is honoring your father? Have not his servants come to you to search and to overthrow and to spy out the land? Their suspicion was understandable, given David's recent military successes against other neighboring kingdoms. But it was also tragically wrong. David's gesture was genuine, not a cover for espionage. The Ammonite officials let fear and paranoia override diplomatic courtesy. Hanun's response was both foolish and insulting. Verse 4 tells us, So Hanun took David's servants and shaved them and cut off their garments in the middle at their hips and sent them away. In ancient Middle Eastern culture, this was an extreme insult. Shaving off beards and exposing men's bodies was a deliberate humiliation designed to shame both the messengers and the king who sent them. David's response shows his care for his servants and his understanding of honor. Verse 5 records, When David was told concerning the men, he sent to meet them, for the men were greatly ashamed. And the king said, Remain at Jericho until your beards have grown and then return. David didn't blame his ambassadors for the humiliation they had suffered. Instead, he provided for their dignity by allowing them to recover privately before returning to court. This kind of thoughtfulness toward his servants helps explain why David inspired such loyalty from his followers. But the insult couldn't go unanswered. Hanun realized he had made a serious mistake and began preparing for war. Verses 6 and 7 describe his military preparations. When the Ammonites saw that they had become a stench to David, Hanun and the Ammonites sent 1,000 talents of silver to hire chariots and horsemen from Mesopotamia, from Aram-Makkah, and from Zobah. They hired 32,000 chariots and the king of Makkah with his army, who came and encamped before Medeba. And the Ammonites were mustered from their cities and came to battle. This was an enormous military force. 32,000 chariots represented the latest military technology of the day. The hiring of mercenaries from multiple kingdoms showed that Hanun was taking the threat seriously and was willing to spend heavily to defend his kingdom. When David learned of these preparations, he responded decisively. Verse 8 tells us, when David heard of it, he sent Joab and all the army of the mighty men. David wasn't taking any chances with this coalition. He sent his best general with his elite troops to handle the situation. The war with the Ammonites and their allies proved to be more complex than a single battle. Joab found himself facing enemies on two fronts, the hired Syrian mercenaries and the Ammonite army. Chapter 19, verses 10 and 11 describe his tactical solution. When Joab saw that the battle was set against him both in front and behind, he chose some of the picked men of Israel and arrayed them against the Syrians. The rest of his men he put in the charge of Abishai his brother, and they were arrayed against the Ammonites. This shows Joab's military genius. Rather than trying to fight both enemies simultaneously, he divided his force and prepared to concentrate against whichever enemy pressed the attack most aggressively. His strategy speech to his brother Abishai is recorded in verse 12, and he said, "If the Syrians are too strong for me, then you shall help me, but if the Ammonites are too strong for you, then I will help you." More importantly, Joab recognized that this was ultimately God's battle, not just Israel's. Verse 13 records his words, "Be strong, and let us use our strength for our people and for the cities of our God, and may the Lord do what seems good to him." Even in the heat of military planning, Joab remembered that they were fighting for God's purposes, not just national interests. The battle went exactly as Joab hoped. Verses 14 and 15 describe the victory. So Joab and the people who were with him drew near before the Syrians for battle, and they fled before him. And when the Ammonites saw that the Syrians fled, they likewise fled before Abishai, Joab's brother, and entered the city. The Syrian mercenaries broke first, and when the Ammonites saw their allies retreating, they lost heart and fled to their fortified cities. Joab had won a complete victory without suffering heavy casualties. The hired coalition had collapsed without achieving any of its objectives, but the Syrians weren't finished. Verse 16 tells us, "But when the Syrians saw that they had been defeated by Israel, they sent messengers and brought out the Syrians who were beyond the Euphrates, with Shophak, the commander of the army of Hadadezer, at their head." This was a much larger force than the original mercenary army. David himself took command for this second phase of the war. Verses 17 and 18 record the decisive battle. "And when it was told to David, he gathered all Israel together and crossed the Jordan and came to them and drew up his forces against them. And when David set his battle in array against the Syrians, they fought with him. And the Syrians fled before Israel, and David killed of the Syrians the men of 7,000 chariots and 40,000 foot soldiers, and put to death also Shophach, the commander of their army." This was an overwhelming victory that ended Syrian resistance permanently. The death of 7,000 chariot crews and 40,000 infantry, plus their commanding general, effectively destroyed Syrian military power in the region. The political results were immediate and far-reaching. Verse 19 tells us, And when the servants of Hadadezer saw that they had been defeated by Israel, they made peace with David and became subject to him. So the Syrians were not willing to save the Ammonites anymore. The entire Syrian confederation switched sides, recognizing that continued resistance was futile. With their allies gone, the Ammonites were left to face Israel alone. Chapter 20, verse 1, describes the final campaign. In the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, Joab led out the army and ravaged the country of the Ammonites and came and besieged Rabbah. Rabbah was the Ammonite capital, and its capture would end the war completely. The siege was successful, though it took considerable time. Verse 2 records the final victory. And David took the crown of their king from his head. He found that it weighed a talent of gold, and in it was a precious stone. And it was placed on David's head, and he brought out the spoil of the city, a very great amount. The crown weighed about 75 pounds and was made of solid gold with precious stones, a symbol of the enormous wealth David had captured. Verse 3 concludes, "And he brought out the people who were in it and set them to labor with saws and iron picks and axes, and thus David did to all the cities of the Ammonites." The defeated population was put to work as forced laborers, probably on construction projects that would benefit both Israel and the region. The Ammonite War had lasted several years, but ended in complete victory for Israel. What began as a diplomatic insult had become a major expansion of David's kingdom and a demonstration of Israel's military superiority over all neighboring powers. After years of military victory and expanding territory, David made a decision that revealed a dangerous change in his heart. Chapter 21, verse 1 introduces the problem. Then Satan stood against Israel and incited David to number Israel. This census wasn't motivated by administrative necessity, but by pride and self-reliance. David's command to Joab is recorded in verse 2. So David said to Joab and the commanders of the army, "Go number Israel from Beersheba to Dan, and bring me a report, that I may know their number." The phrase "that I may know their number" reveals David's motivation. He wanted to know how powerful his kingdom had become. Joab immediately recognized that this was wrong. Verse 3 records his protest. But Joab said, "May the Lord add to his people 100 times as many as they are. Are they not, my lord the king, all of them my lord's servants? Why then should my lord require this? Why should it be a cause of a guilt for Israel?" Joab understood that Israel's strength came from God, not from the size of its population. A census conducted for military purposes suggested that David was beginning to trust in human resources rather than divine protection. Joab even warned that this would bring guilt on the entire nation, but David's mind was made up. Verse 4 tells us, "But the king's word prevailed against Joab, so Joab departed and went throughout all Israel and came back to Jerusalem." Even though Joab was David's most trusted general and closest advisor, David overruled his objections and insisted the census be completed. The census took considerable time to complete. Verse 5 gives us the final numbers. "And Joab gave the sum of the numbering of the people to David. In all Israel there were 100,000 men who drew the sword, and in Judah 470,000 who drew the sword." This represented an enormous military force, over 1.5 million trained soldiers. But Joab's resistance to the project continued. Verse 6 tells us, "But he did not include Levi and Benjamin in the numbering, for the king's command was abhorrent to Joab." Joab found ways to minimize his participation in what he considered a sinful act. The Levites weren't counted because they didn't serve in the military, and Benjamin may have been omitted because the census was interrupted. David's response to the numbers reveals that his heart was already being convicted. Verse 8 records, "And David said to God, I have sinned greatly in that I have done this thing." But now, please, take away the iniquity of your servant, for I have acted very foolishly." David realized that his pride had led him into sin against God. God's response came through the prophet Gad, who offered David a choice of punishments. Verses 11 and 12 record the options. "So Gad came to David and said to him, 'Thus says the Lord, choose what you will, either 3 years of famine or 3 months of being swept away before your foes, while the sword of your enemies overtakes you, or else 3 days of the sword of the Lord, pestilence on the land, with the angel of the Lord destroying throughout all the territory of Israel.'" All 3 options were severe, but they represented different sources of judgment: natural disaster, military defeat, or direct divine intervention. David's choice reveals his understanding of God's character. Verse 13 records his decision. "Then David said to Gad, 'I am in great distress. Let me fall into the hand of the Lord, for his mercy is very great, but do not let me fall into the hand of man.'" David chose the plague because he trusted God's mercy more than human mercy. He knew that even in judgment, God would be compassionate and would limit the punishment to what was necessary. The plague began immediately and was devastating in its scope. Chapter 21, verse 14 tells us, "So the Lord sent a pestilence on Israel, and 70,000 men of Israel fell. In just 3 days, more people died from the plague than would typically die in a major war." This demonstrated both the seriousness of David's sin and the reality of God's judgment. But God's mercy was also evident. Verse 15 describes the angel's approach to Jerusalem. "And God sent the angel to Jerusalem to destroy it. But as he was about to destroy it, the Lord saw, and he relented from the calamity. And he said to the destroying angel, 'It is enough. Now stay your hand.' And the angel of the Lord was standing by the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite." God could have allowed the plague to continue until far more people died, but his mercy intervened. The judgment was limited to what was necessary to teach the lesson and demonstrate the consequences of pride. The location where the angel stopped would prove to be highly significant. David's response shows genuine repentance and leadership. Verse 17 records his prayer. "And David said to God, 'Was it not I who gave command to number the people? It is I who have sinned and done great evil. But these sheep, what have they done? Please let your hand, O Lord my God, be against me and against my father's house, but do not let the plague be upon your people.'" This prayer reveals David's heart as a shepherd king. He took full responsibility for his sin and was willing to bear the consequences personally rather than see his people continue to suffer. He called them sheep, acknowledging his role as their protector and his failure to protect them from the consequences of his own pride. God's response came through the prophet Gad, who gave David specific instructions. Verse 18 tells us, "Then the angel of the Lord commanded Gad to say to David that David should go up and raise an altar to the Lord on the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite." The place where judgment stopped would become a place of worship and sacrifice. David immediately obeyed, going to Ornan's threshing floor. Verses 20 through 23 describe the encounter. "Now Ornan was threshing wheat. He turned and saw the angel, and his 4 sons who were with him hid themselves. As David came to Ornan, Ornan looked and saw David and went out from the threshing floor, and paid homage to David with his face to the ground. And David said to Ornan, 'Give me the site of the threshing floor, that I may build on it an altar to the Lord. Give it to me at its full price, that the plague may be averted from the people.' Then Ornan said to David, 'Take it, and let my lord the king do what seems good to him. See, I give the oxen for burnt offerings, and the threshing sledges for the wood, and the wheat for a grain offering. I give it all.'" Ornan's generosity shows the impact David's leadership had on people throughout his kingdom. Even this Jebusite farmer was willing to give everything he had to help end the plague that was devastating the nation. His offer to donate the entire site, plus animals and materials for sacrifice, was extraordinarily generous. But David refused to accept the gift. Verse 24 records his response. But King David said to Ornan, "No, but I will buy them for the full price. I will not take for the Lord what is yours, nor offer burnt offerings that cost me nothing." David understood that meaningful worship requires personal sacrifice. Taking a free gift wouldn't have the same spiritual significance as paying the full price from his own resources. Verse 25 tells us the transaction. So David paid Ornan 600 shekels of gold by weight for the site. This was an enormous sum, far more than agricultural land would normally cost. But David was purchasing more than a threshing floor. He was securing the location where God had chosen to end the plague and receive worship. The purchase of Ornan's threshing floor was much more significant than it appeared at the time. This would become the location of Solomon's temple and the center of Jewish worship for centuries to come. David's immediate response to God's command shows his heart for worship and his understanding of the seriousness of the moment. Verse 26 describes David's sacrifice, and David built there an altar to the Lord and presented burnt offerings and peace offerings and called on the Lord. And the Lord answered him with fire from heaven upon the altar of burnt offering. The fire from heaven was God's sign of acceptance, showing that the sacrifice was pleasing and the plague would end. This divine fire was similar to what had happened when the tabernacle was first dedicated and when Elijah later challenged the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. It was God's unmistakable sign that he had accepted the worship and the location was now sacred. The plague stopped immediately, confirming that God's wrath had been satisfied. Verse 27 tells us the result. Then the Lord commanded the angel, and he put his sword back into its sheath. The destroying angel's mission was complete. Justice had been served, mercy had been shown, and worship had been restored. The crisis was over, but its consequences would shape Israel's future for generations. David's experience with the census and its aftermath taught him valuable lessons about the dangers of pride and self-reliance. More importantly, it established the location where God would choose to place his temple. What began as judgment ended as preparation for the greatest building project in Israel's history. Chapter 21 verse 30 shows how this experience affected David's worship practices. But David could not go before it to inquire of God, for he was afraid because of the sword of the angel of the Lord. The traditional place of worship at Gibeon no longer seemed adequate after David had seen God's power demonstrated so dramatically at the threshing floor. This location would become central to David's plans for the temple. He had found not just a place to offer sacrifice, but the place where God had chosen to receive worship from his people. The purchase of the threshing floor was actually the first step in building the temple, though neither David nor Ornan realized it at the time. The entire episode of the census, plague, and purchase demonstrates how God can use even human failures to accomplish his purposes. David's pride led to national suffering, but it also led to the identification of the temple site and a deeper understanding of God's mercy and justice. The consequences of sin were real and severe, but God's ultimate purpose was redemptive rather than merely punitive. With the location of the future temple established and God's blessing confirmed, David threw himself into the most ambitious preparation project in ancient history. Chapter 22 verse 1 shows his recognition of what had been revealed. Then David said, "Here shall be the house of the Lord God, and here the altar of burnt offering for Israel." The threshing floor where the plague had ended would become the site of Solomon's temple. David understood that he wouldn't be the one to build the temple, but that didn't stop him from preparing everything possible for his successor. Verse 2 describes the beginning of his preparations. David commanded to gather together the resident aliens who were in the land of Israel, and he set stone cutters to prepare dressed stones for building the house of God. David was organizing a massive workforce to quarry and shape the stones that would form the temple's foundation and walls. The scale of David's preparations was staggering. Verses 3 and 4 give us some indication of the quantities involved. David also provided great quantities of iron for nails, for the doors of the gates, and for clamps, as well as bronze in quantities beyond weighing, and cedar trees without number. For the Sidonians and Tyrians brought great quantities of cedar to David. The phrase, quantities beyond weighing, suggests amounts so large that keeping precise records became impractical. David's motivation is explained in verse 5. For David said, Solomon, my son is young and inexperienced, and the house that is to be built for the Lord must be exceedingly magnificent, of fame and glory throughout all lands. I will therefore make preparation for it. So David provided materials in great quantity before his death. This wasn't about making Solomon's job easier. It was about ensuring that God's house would be worthy of his glory. The amounts David accumulated were truly extraordinary. Chapter 22, verse 14 gives us specific numbers. With great pains I have provided for the house of the Lord 100,000 talents of gold, 1,000 talents of silver, and bronze and iron beyond weighing, for there is so much of it. I have also provided timber and stone, and you may add to them. To put this in perspective, 100,000 talents of gold would weigh about 3,750 tons, and 1,000 talents of silver would weigh about 37,500 tons. These weren't just raw materials. They represented years of careful accumulation from military victories, tribute payments, and trade relationships. Every conquest David had made, every enemy he had defeated, had contributed something to this collection. The gold shields from Syria, the bronze from various cities, the silver from tribute payments, all of it was being gathered for one purpose. Verse 15 shows that David had also arranged for skilled workers. You have an abundance of workmen, stonecutters, masons, carpenters, and all kinds of craftsmen without number, skilled in working gold, silver, bronze, and iron. David wasn't just collecting materials. He was assembling the human resources needed to turn those materials into a magnificent temple. The writer emphasizes David's personal investment in verse 16. Of the gold, silver, bronze, and iron there is no limit. Arise and work, the Lord be with you. David had literally given everything he could to ensure the temple would be built according to God's standards rather than human limitations. David knew that accumulating materials was only part of preparing for the temple. Solomon would need wisdom, encouragement, and clear direction to complete such an enormous project. Chapter 22, verses 6 through 16, record David's personal instructions to his son, showing both kingly authority and fatherly love. The conversation begins with David explaining why he couldn't build the temple himself. Verses 7 and 8 record his words, My son, I had it in my heart to build a house to the name of the Lord my God. But the word of the Lord came to me, saying, You have shed much blood and have waged great wars. You shall not build a house to my name because you have shed so much blood before me on the earth. David had been a man of war, and God wanted the temple built by a man of peace. But this wasn't a rejection of David's warrior role. It was recognition that different seasons required different kinds of leadership. Verses 9 and 10 explain God's plan. Behold, a son shall be born to you, who shall be a man of rest. I will give him rest from all his surrounding enemies. For his name shall be Solomon, and I will give peace and quiet to Israel in his days. He shall build a house for my name. He shall be my son, and I will be his father, and I will establish his royal throne in Israel forever. Solomon's name meant peace, and his reign would be characterized by the peace that David's wars had made possible. The temple couldn't be built during wartime. It required the stability and prosperity that only peace could provide. David's battles had been necessary to create the conditions for Solomon's building project. David then gave Solomon specific spiritual instructions. Verse 11 contains his blessing and prayer. "Now, my son, the Lord be with you, so that you may succeed, and build the house of the Lord your God, as he has spoken concerning you." David understood that success in this project would depend on God's blessing, not just human effort or resources. The practical advice follows in verse 12. "Only may the Lord grant you discretion and understanding, that when he gives you charge over Israel, you may keep the law of the Lord your God." David had learned through his own mistakes that a king's success depended on obedience to God's word. Without divine wisdom and faithful obedience, even the most magnificent building would be meaningless. Verse 13 contains both encouragement and warning. "Then you will prosper if you are careful to observe the statutes and the rules that the Lord commanded Moses for Israel. Be strong and courageous. Fear not. Do not be dismayed." David was passing on the same encouragement God had given to Joshua centuries earlier. The challenges were enormous, but God's presence would make success possible. David reminded Solomon of the preparations already made, but also challenged him to continue the work. Verse 14 lists the accumulated resources, and verse 15 mentions the available workforce. But verse 16 ends with the crucial reminder, "Arise and work, the Lord be with you." The materials and workers were important, but they weren't enough by themselves. Solomon would need to take initiative, provide leadership, and depend on God's blessing throughout the project. David was giving his son both the tools for success and the responsibility to use them faithfully. David's preparations for the temple weren't limited to materials and construction workers. He also completely reorganized Israel's religious system to serve the permanent temple rather than the portable tabernacle. Chapter 23 begins this massive reorganization project with a census of the Levites. Verse 1 sets the context. "When David was old and full of days, he made Solomon his son king over Israel." David was approaching the end of his life and wanted to ensure a smooth transition, not just of political power, but of religious organization as well. Verse 2 describes the scope of his planning. David assembled all the leaders of Israel and the priests and the Levites. The Levitical census revealed the scale of the religious establishment. Verses 3 and 4 give us the numbers. The Levites, 30 years old and upward, were numbered, and the total was 38,000 men. 24,000 of these, David said, shall have charge of the work in the house of the Lord. 6,000 shall be officers and judges. This represented a massive workforce dedicated entirely to religious service. Verse 5 continues the breakdown. 4,000 shall be gatekeepers, and 4,000 shall offer praises to the Lord with the instruments that I have made for praise. David had created an entire orchestra of 4,000 musicians, far larger than anything Israel had ever seen before. This wasn't just about having music during worship. It was about creating an atmosphere of praise that would match the magnificence of the temple itself. David divided the Levites according to their ancestral families. Verse 6 explains, "And David organized them in divisions corresponding to the sons of Levi, Gershon, Kohath, and Merari." This wasn't arbitrary. It followed the organizational pattern God had established during the wilderness period, but adapted it for permanent temple service. The duties were carefully specified for each group. Chapter 23, verses 28 through 32, describe the responsibilities of the Levites in general. For their duty was to assist the sons of Aaron for the service of the house of the Lord, having the care of the courts and the chambers, the cleansing, of all that is holy, and any work for the service of the house of God. Their duty was also to assist with the showbread, the flour for the grain offering, the wafers of unleavened bread, the baked offering, the offering mixed with oil, and all measures of quantity or size. And they were to stand every morning, thanking and praising the Lord, and likewise at evening, and whenever burnt offerings were offered to the Lord on Sabbaths, new moons, and feast days, according to the number required of them, regularly before the Lord. Thus they were to keep charge of the tent of meeting and the sanctuary, and to attend the sons of Aaron, their brothers, for the service of the house of the Lord. This detailed job description shows how thoroughly David planned the temple operations. Every aspect of worship was considered, from maintaining the building, to preparing the sacrifices, to leading the musical praise. Nothing was left to chance or improvisation. The age requirement was also adjusted for the new circumstances. Verse 24 explains, "These were the sons of Levi by their fathers' houses, the heads of fathers' houses, as they were listed according to the number of the names of the individuals from 20 years old and upward who were to do the work for the service of the house of the Lord." The minimum age was lowered from 30 to 20, reflecting the increased need for workers in the larger temple complex. David's reasoning for this change is given in verses 25 through 27. For David said, "The Lord, the God of Israel, has given rest to his people, and he dwells in Jerusalem forever. And so the Levites no longer need to carry the tabernacle or any of the things for its service." For by the last words of David, the sons of Levi were numbered from 20 years old and upward. The physical demands of carrying the tabernacle through the wilderness were gone, but new opportunities for service were opening up. One of David's most significant innovations was the creation of organized musical worship on an unprecedented scale. Chapter 25 details this musical revolution that would transform not just Israel's worship, but influence music throughout the ancient world. Verse 1 introduces the concept, "David and the chiefs of the service also set apart for the service the sons of Asaph and of Heman and of Jeduthun, who prophesied with lyres, with harps, and with cymbals." The key word here is prophesied. David wasn't just organizing entertainment, he was establishing a form of musical ministry where skilled musicians would deliver God's messages through inspired songs. Music became a vehicle for divine revelation, not just artistic expression. Three family heads, Asaph, Heman, and Jeduthun, each led significant musical groups. Verse 2 details Asaph's family. Of the sons of Asaph, Zaccur, Joseph, Nethaniah, and Asharela, sons of Asaph under the direction of Asaph, who prophesied under the direction of the king. Asaph himself was a composer whose psalms are still sung today, and his sons continued the family tradition of musical ministry. Verses 3 through 5 describe the other families. Of Jeduthun, the sons of Jeduthun, Gedaliah, Zeri, Jeshiah, Shimei, Hashabiah, and Mattithiah, 6, under the direction of their father Jeduthun, who prophesied with the lyre in thanksgiving and praise to the Lord. Of Heman, the sons of Heman, Bukiah, Mattaniah, Uziel, Shebuel, and Jeremoth, Hananiah, Hanani, Eliathah, Gidalti, and Ramamti-Ezer, Joshbekashah, Malothi, Hothir, Mahazioth. All these were the sons of Heman, the king's seer, according to the promise of God to exalt him, for God had given Heman 14 sons and 3 daughters. Heman's large family was seen as a sign of God's blessing on his musical ministry. The phrase, "the king's seer," indicates that Heman had prophetic responsibilities beyond just musical leadership. These weren't just musicians, they were spiritual leaders who used music as their primary ministry tool. The organizational structure was sophisticated. Verse 6 explains, All these were under the direction of their fathers, in the music in the house of the Lord, with cymbals, harps, and lyres for the service of the house of God. Asaph, Jeduthun, and Heman were under the order of the king. There was clear hierarchy and accountability, ensuring that the musical ministry would be coordinated and purposeful. The total number of musicians was impressive. Verse 7 gives us the count. The number of them along with their brothers, who were trained in singing to the Lord, all who were skillful, was 288. These were professional-level musicians who had been specifically trained for temple service. But remember, this was in addition to the 4,000 musicians mentioned earlier who played instruments of praise. The selection process was fair and impartial. Verse 8 describes the method, and they cast lots for their duties, small and great, teacher and pupil alike. Even the most senior musicians had to accept their assignments by lot rather than claiming positions based on seniority or family connections. This ensured that God's will, rather than human preferences, determined the organization. The rest of chapter 25 lists the 24 divisions of musicians, each assigned to serve during specific periods throughout the year. This rotation system meant that the temple would always have skilled musical leadership available, but no individual would be overburdened with constant service. David's musical innovations had lasting impact far beyond the temple. The psalms that came from this period influenced not just Jewish worship, but Christian worship for centuries to come. The combination of skilled musicianship with prophetic inspiration created a form of worship that engaged both emotions and intellect in praise to God. The temple would contain enormous wealth and require careful security, so David organized a sophisticated system of gatekeepers and treasurers. Chapter 26 details these crucial but often overlooked aspects of temple operation. Verse 1 introduces the gatekeepers. As for the divisions of the gatekeepers, of the Korahites, Meshelemiah the son of Korah, of the sons of Asaph, the Korahites, had a special history with God's service. Their ancestor Korah had rebelled against Moses and been destroyed, but his descendants had been forgiven and restored to positions of trust. This shows God's mercy and his willingness to use people despite their family history. Verses 2 through 11 list the gatekeeper families and their numbers. The total comes to significant numbers. All these were sons of Obed-Edom with their sons and brothers, able men qualified for the service, 62 of Obed-Edom. These weren't just guards. They were able men qualified for the service, indicating that gatekeeping required skill, reliability, and spiritual maturity. The gatekeepers were assigned to specific locations around the temple complex. Verses 13 through 16 describe the assignments, and they cast lots by fathers' houses, small and great alike, for their gates. The lot for the east fell to Shelemiah. They cast lots also for his son Zechariah, a shrewd counselor, and his lot came out for the north. Obed-Edom's came out for the south, and to his sons was allotted the gatehouse. For Shuppim and Hosah it came out for the west, at the gate of Shaleketh, on the road that goes up. Watch corresponded to watch. Each gate required constant vigilance. Verse 17 explains the staffing. On the east there were 6 each day, on the north 4 each day, on the south 4 each day, as well as 2 and 2 at the gatehouse. This represents a significant workforce. At least 18 gatekeepers on duty at any given time, working in shifts around the clock. But the gatekeepers' responsibilities went beyond just security. Verses 20 through 28 describe the treasurers who managed the temple's wealth. And of the Levites, Ahijah had charge of the treasuries of the house of God and the treasuries of the dedicated gifts. The sons of Ladan, the sons of the Gershonites belonging to Ladan, the heads of the fathers' houses belonging to Ladan the Gershonite, Jehili. The sons of Jehili, Zetham, and Joel, his brother, were in charge of the treasuries of the house of the Lord. The temple treasuries contained multiple categories of wealth. Verse 26 explains, this Shelomoth and his brothers were in charge of all the treasuries of the dedicated gifts that David the king and the heads of the fathers' houses, and the officers of the thousands and the hundreds, and the commanders of the army had dedicated. These included not just David's massive accumulation of materials, but also gifts from military officers and family leaders throughout Israel. Verse 27 shows the source of much of this wealth. From spoil won in battles, they dedicated gifts for the maintenance of the house of the Lord. Every military victory had contributed something to the temple treasury. The wealth wasn't accumulated through taxation or oppression, but through God's blessing on Israel's defensive wars. The responsibility was enormous. Verse 28 indicates the scope. Also, all that Samuel the seer and Saul, the son of Kish, and Abner, the son of Ner, and Joab the son of Zeruiah had dedicated, all dedicated gifts were in the care of Shelomoth and his brothers. Generations of leaders had contributed to this treasury, and it all had to be carefully managed and protected. David's final organizational achievement was establishing Israel's first professional military structure. Chapter 27 describes a sophisticated system that provided security while avoiding the burden of maintaining a large standing army year-round. Verse 1 introduces the concept, "This is the number of the people of Israel, the heads of fathers' houses, the commanders of thousands and hundreds, and their officers who served the king in all matters concerning the divisions that came and went, month by month throughout the year, each division numbering 24,000. This was a brilliant system. Instead of keeping a massive army permanently mobilized, David organized the entire military-age population into 12 divisions of 24,000 men each. Each division served actively for 1 month per year, ensuring that Israel always had a trained, ready force of 24,000, while allowing most men to spend 11 months per year on their normal occupations. The leadership was drawn from David's proven warriors. Verses 2 through 15 list the monthly commanders, beginning with Jashobeam the son of Zabdiel was in charge of the 1st division in the 1st month. In his division were 24,000. Jashobeam was the same mighty man who had killed 300 enemies in a single battle, exactly the kind of proven leader who could command respect from 24,000 men. Other famous names appear in the list: Dodai the Ahohite, 2nd month; Benaiah the son of Jehoiada, 3rd month; and Asahel the brother of Joab, 4th month. These were men whose courage and loyalty had been tested in actual combat during David's rise to power. The system provided several advantages. It maintained military readiness without the economic burden of a permanent standing army. It gave military training to the entire male population, creating a huge pool of experienced soldiers for times of crisis. It rotated leadership opportunities among David's proven officers, preventing any single commander from accumulating too much power. Beyond the monthly divisions, David also established tribal military leaders. Verses 16 through 22 list over the tribes of Israel. For the Reubenites, Eleazar the son of Zikri was chief officer. For the Simeonites, Shephatiah the son of Maacah. For Levi, Hashabiah the son of Kemuel. For Aaron, Zadok. For Judah, Elihu, one of David's brothers. For Issachar, Omri the son of Michael. This dual system, monthly national divisions plus tribal organizations, ensured that Israel could respond to threats both quickly through the active monthly division and comprehensively by mobilizing entire tribes when necessary. The tribal leaders maintained local military readiness while the national commanders provided coordinated defense. The administration required careful record-keeping. Verses 25 through 31 describe the various administrative positions. Over the king's treasuries was Asmaveth the son of Adiel, and over the treasuries in the country, in the cities, in the villages, and in the towers, was Jonathan the son of Uzziah. And over those who did the work of the field for tilling the soil was Ezri, the son of Chelub. These weren't just military appointments. They represented a complete governmental structure that could manage both war and peace effectively. David was creating institutions that would outlast his own reign and provide stability for Solomon's peaceful building projects. As David's reign drew to a close, he called one final assembly to formally transfer power to Solomon and ensure that all his preparations for the temple would be carried forward. Chapter 28, verse 1 describes the gathering. David assembled at Jerusalem all the officials of Israel, the officials of the tribes, the officers of the divisions that served the king, the commanders of thousands, the commanders of hundreds, the stewards of all the property and livestock of the king and his sons, together with the palace officials, the mighty men, and all the seasoned warriors. This was an unprecedented gathering representing every level of Israel's leadership. David wanted to make sure that everyone who would play a role in Solomon's reign understood the transition plans and their responsibilities in building the temple. David's speech to this assembly reveals both his heart as a father and his vision as a king. Verses 2 through 6 record his words. Then King David rose to his feet and said, "Hear me, my brothers and my people. I had it in my heart to build a house of rest for the ark of the covenant of the Lord and for the footstool of our God, and I made preparations for building. But God said to me, 'You may not build a house for my name, for you are a man of war and have shed blood. Yet the Lord God of Israel chose me from all my father's house to be king over Israel forever, for he chose Judah as leader, and in the house of Judah my father's house. And among my father's sons he took pleasure in me to make me king over all Israel. And of all my sons, for the Lord has given me many sons, he has chosen Solomon my son to sit on the throne of the kingdom of the Lord over Israel. He said to me, "It is Solomon your son who shall build my house and my courts, for I have chosen him to be my son, and I will be his father." David's humility shines through this speech. He didn't present himself as a self-made king, but as someone chosen by God's grace. He acknowledged that the temple project belonged to God, not to any human ruler. Most importantly, he made clear that Solomon's kingship wasn't just political succession, but divine selection. The charge to Solomon was both public and personal. Verses 9 and 10 contain David's final words to his son, "And you, Solomon my son, know the God of your father, and serve him with a whole heart and with a willing mind. For the Lord searches all hearts and understands every plan and thought. If you seek him, he will be found by you, but if you forsake him, he will cast you off forever. Be careful now, for the Lord has chosen you to build a house for the sanctuary. Be strong and do it." This wasn't just advice. It was a public commissioning that held Solomon accountable to both God and the nation's leaders. David was making clear that success would depend on Solomon's spiritual condition, not just his administrative abilities or the resources David had accumulated. Then David did something remarkable. Verses 11 through 19 describe how he gave Solomon detailed architectural plans. Then David gave Solomon his son the plan of the vestibule of the temple and of its houses, its treasuries, its upper rooms, and its inner chambers, and of the room for the mercy seat, and the plan of all that he had in mind for the courts of the house of the Lord, all the surrounding chambers, the treasuries of the house of God, and the treasuries for dedicated gifts. These weren't just David's ideas, they were divinely inspired blueprints. Verse 19 makes this clear. "All this he made clear to me in writing from the hand of the Lord, all the work to be done according to the plan." Just as Moses had received detailed instructions for the tabernacle, David had received specific plans for the temple. Solomon wouldn't have to guess about design or functionality. Everything had been revealed by God himself. The plans included not just the building, but also the furnishings and service items. Verses 13 through 18 list specific details about golden and silver vessels, lampstands, tables, forks, basins, and even the golden chariot for the cherubim above the ark. Every element had been carefully planned and specified. David's final act as king was to lead his people in worship and generosity toward the temple project. Chapter 29 records a remarkable scene of national dedication that showed how completely David had transformed Israel's heart toward God. Verse 1 begins David's final appeal. And King David said to all the assembly, Solomon my son, whom alone God has chosen, is young and inexperienced, and the work is great. For the palace will not be for man, but for the Lord God. David's appeal wasn't based on Solomon's abilities or his own authority, but on the magnitude of what they were attempting to build. This wasn't just another royal construction project. It was God's house, and it deserved their best efforts and resources. David then made his own final contribution public. Verses 2 through 5 describe his personal gift. So I have provided for the house of my God, so far as I was able, the gold for the things of gold, the silver for the things of silver, and the bronze for the things of bronze, the iron for the things of iron, and wood for the things of wood, besides great quantities of onyx and stones for setting, antimony, colored stones, all sorts of precious stones and marble. Moreover, in addition to all that I have provided for the holy house, I have a treasure of my own of gold and silver, and because of my devotion to the house of my God, I give it to the house of my God. 3,000 talents of gold, of the gold of Ophir, and 7,000 talents of refined silver, for overlaying the walls of the house, and for all the work to be done by craftsmen, gold for the things of gold, and silver for the things of silver. Who then will offer willingly, consecrating himself today to the Lord? David's personal contribution of 3,000 talents of gold and 7,000 talents of silver was separate from all the resources he had accumulated as king. This represented his private wealth, perhaps savings from his years as a warrior and tribute from grateful subjects. By giving his personal treasure, David was demonstrating that the temple deserved not just public resources, but private sacrifice. The response was overwhelming. Verses 6 through 8 describe the people's generosity. Then the leaders of fathers' houses made their free will offerings, as did also the leaders of the tribes, the commanders of thousands and of hundreds, and the officers over the king's work. They gave for the service of the house of God 5,000 talents and 10,000 darics of gold, 10,000 talents of silver, 18,000 talents of bronze, and 100,000 talents of iron. And whoever had precious stones gave them to the treasury of the house of the Lord in the care of Jehiel the Gershonite. The total contributions were staggering. Combined with David's earlier accumulations and his personal gift, the temple would have resources that exceeded those of any building project in the ancient world. But more important than the amounts was the spirit behind the giving. Verse 9 captures the atmosphere. Then the people rejoiced because they had given willingly, for with a whole heart they had offered freely to the Lord. David the king also rejoiced greatly. This wasn't reluctant duty or royal taxation. It was joyful worship expressed through generous giving. David had created a culture where supporting God's work was seen as privilege rather than burden. David's final prayer reveals his understanding of what had just happened. Verses 10 through 13 record his words. Therefore David blessed the Lord in the presence of all the assembly. And David said, Blessed are you, O Lord, the God of Israel our Father, forever and ever. Yours, O Lord, is the greatness and the power, and the glory and the victory and the majesty, for all that is in the heavens and in the earth is yours. Yours is the kingdom, O Lord, and you are exalted as head above all. Both riches and honor come from you, and you rule over all. In your hand are power and might, and in your hand it is to make great and to give strength to all. And now we thank you, our God, and praise your glorious name. David recognized that everything they were giving to God had originally come from God. Verses 14 through 16 continue his prayer. But who am I, and what is my people, that we should be able thus to offer willingly? For all things come from you, and of your own have we given you. For we are strangers before you and sojourners, as all our fathers were. Our days on the earth are like a shadow, and there is no abiding. O Lord our God, all this abundance that we have provided for building you a house for your holy name comes from your hand and is all your own. This prayer shows the spiritual maturity David had gained through decades of following God. He understood that human achievements are temporary, that earthly wealth belongs ultimately to God, and that the greatest privilege is being allowed to participate in God's eternal purposes. David's final request was for Solomon and the people. Verses 18 and 19 record his prayer. O Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel our fathers, keep forever such purposes and thoughts in the hearts of your people, and direct their hearts toward you. Grant to Solomon my son a whole heart, that he may keep your commandments, your testimonies, and your statutes, performing all of them, and that he may build the palace for which I have made provision. The assembly concluded with worship and celebration. Verses 20 through 22 describe the scene. Then David said to all the assembly, Bless the Lord your God. And all the assembly blessed the Lord, the God of their fathers, and bowed their heads and paid homage to the Lord and to the king. And they offered sacrifices to the Lord, and on the next day offered burnt offerings to the Lord, 1,000 bulls, 1,000 rams, and 1,000 lambs, with their drink offerings and sacrifices in abundance for all Israel. And they ate and drank before the Lord on that day with great gladness. Solomon was formally crowned in this atmosphere of worship and celebration. Verse 22 continues, And they made Solomon the son of David king the second time, and they anointed him as prince for the Lord, and Zadok as priest. The transition was complete, with both political and religious leadership confirmed by the entire nation. The chronicler's final assessment of David appears in verses 26 through 30. Thus David the son of Jesse reigned over all Israel. The time that he reigned over Israel was 40 years. He reigned 7 years in Hebron and 33 years in Jerusalem. Then he died at a good old age, full of days, riches, and honor. And Solomon, his son, reigned in his place. Now, the acts of King David, from first to last, are written in the Chronicles of Samuel the seer, and in the Chronicles of Nathan the prophet, and in the Chronicles of Gad the seer, with accounts of all his rule and his might, and of the circumstances that came upon him and upon Israel, and upon all the kingdoms of the countries. David had accomplished everything God had called him to do. He united the nation, expanded its borders, accumulated resources for the temple, organized religious and civil institutions, and prepared his successor for success. Most importantly, he had demonstrated what it meant to be a king after God's own heart, someone who sought God's will above personal ambition and who used power to serve rather than to dominate. The kingdom David was passing to Solomon was strong, prosperous, peaceful, and spiritually vibrant. The temple preparations were complete. The organizational systems were in place, and the people were united behind their new king. David's legacy would shape Israel for centuries to come and ultimately point toward the greater son of David, who would establish an eternal kingdom that would never end. If this journey through 1 Chronicles has opened your eyes to God's incredible plan and his faithfulness throughout history, I want to ask you to do two things. First, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss these deep dives into God's Word. There are so many more biblical treasures waiting to be discovered, and I want you to be part of this community of people who are passionate about understanding Scripture like never before. Second, share this video with someone who needs to hear this message. Maybe it's a friend who thinks the Bible is boring, or a family member who's struggling to see God's plan in their own life. The story of David shows us that God's plans are always bigger and better than anything we could imagine for ourselves. Comment below and let me know which part of David's story impacted you the most. Was it his humility in the face of God's promises? His heart for worship that transformed a nation? Or maybe the way God used even his mistakes to accomplish divine purposes? Remember, the same God who was with David through every triumph and every failure is with you today. Your story matters to him, and just like David, he has plans for your life that are bigger than you can imagine. Until next time, keep digging deeper into God's Word, and I'll see you in the next video where we'll continue exploring the Bible like you've never seen it before.